This is a video about the album Hospice, released in 2009 by New York-based band The Antlers. The album has exploded in popularity since its release and tells the story of a protagonist pulling himself through the other side of an abusive relationship. The album attracted attention because of the powerful allegory that it used to demonstrate the gradual decay of a relationship, a cancer ward, and a doctor falling in love with a terminally ill patient. At least, that's how I've chosen to see it. Myself and many other people have come up with this idea that the album is a bigger allegory for a relationship. Part of the mystique of Hospice is the true story behind the record. Singer and Antlers frontman Peter Silverman has purposefully kept the full details of the album under wraps for all parties involved. But through listening to the album, you gain a pretty solid picture of events, even if they're told through a cleverly disguised tragedy. So let's dive into the album headfirst, beginning with the second track, Kettering. Kettering begins with a solo piano and Peter's fragile vocals. The first track is told from the perspective of the hospice worker, and the lyrics go as follows. There's an important distinction to make with the lyrics of the album. There's the story side and the allegory side. In the story side, a hospice worker falls in love with a terminally ill patient who seems to have some kind of bone cancer or disease, which leaves her bedridden or at least permanently confined to a hospice ward. In the allegory side, a man enters an abusive relationship with a woman who, regardless of what he does for her, never seems satisfied. This is quite striking because both evoke a sense of powerlessness. The hospice worker can't do anything to stop the patient from dying, and the man in the allegory can't do anything to save the relationship. Both are about something dying slowly over time. But there's a sense of regret here in the lyrics. I wish that I had known the unpayable debt that I owed you. This is the main character reflecting back on the experience, almost wishing that it never happened. Additionally, you have the word hired. This almost gets skipped over when you read it for the first time, but it plays a part in both the allegory and the story. A hospice worker is hired to take care of a patient, but in the relationship, the man feels as though he's been dragged into the relationship, almost to play a part. There's no love or anything worthwhile in it, it's just a job, something he's hired for. Describing the relationship as something he's been hired for already sets the tone that the situation is quite obviously less than ideal. A few lines later, we have the first interactions between the hospice worker and the patient. The hospice worker, trying to cheer up the patient, talks to them and tries to make their day a bit better, but the patient, either out of spite due to a cold or freezing personality or just a defensiveness brought about by her condition, rejects this and says she hates his tone and just wants him to leave. Perhaps the patient feels this cheery tone is fake or something just put on as a mask by all of the workers in the hospice, and she craves some kind of real human conversation or contact. This is the first time that the hospice worker is admitting his feelings for the patient. He even alters a line earlier in the track. The line, "You made me sleep and uneven," parallels a line just before, "kept you sleeping and even," referring to the heavy pain medication the patient must be on, with tubes all over her body, evoking a pitiful image that the main character finds himself empathizing with. And the last line, "They told me that there was no saving you," plays a part in both worlds. In the hospice, it means the patient is terminal. The nurse shouldn't be preoccupied with the idea of somehow saving her just because he loves her. However, in the relationship, perhaps others have warned the main character about her, but he remains ignorant and believes that he can somehow change or fix her by being in a relationship. With the introduction of the album complete, the stage is set between two parallel worlds, a hospice ward and a new couple in an already turbulent relationship. In the next track, things begin to decline even further, starting with a piece of confused dialogue from the main character. The first line, "curtains in," evokes the image of the sliding curtains within a hospital and someone asking for them to be closed, for something private to take place. It seems to signal the initial closing off of the main character from the outside world into the fantasy he's building inside of his head that this is a stable and savable relationship, that everything is okay, and that the person he's dating isn't abusive. The next couple lines start us off and "you swing first" not only signifies physical violence, but also the main character's reluctance to change anything. He's now resigned to this role in the relationship, almost acting out a particular part in a play where he engages in a physical fight with his girlfriend. But he's confused with it too. He never seems to know what he does to make her upset or angry. "Sorry, I don't know what I said, but you're crying now again, and that only makes it worse." It's either that the woman uses crying to get her way and steer an argument to her side, or that she suffers from something where her mood can change drastically out of nowhere. These lines further drive home the idea of the main character finding a warped sense of home and comfort in the abuse. His norm is now fighting, arguing, and from the lyrics, saving his girlfriend from apparent suicide attempts. He seems to be dragging her away from these attempts by almost incentivizing her to go back to the usual patterns, being verbally abusive and making out that she's the victim, because he'd rather have that than everything get even worse and she somehow managed to successfully take her own life. To him, he'd rather things just carried on the way they are, instead of getting even worse. The lyrics then pass through into the allegory again, where the hospice worker just wants to take Sylvia's temperature. It's strange because on the hospice side you feel sorry for Sylvia, as she's subject to endless medical treatment, fake and cheery interactions from the workers, and now having invasive measures such as a temperature taken, so of course she'd feel frustrated and lash out. But on the other hand, in the relationship, Sylvia is the enemy, and you feel sorry for the main character instead. These two worlds being back to back and mixing together lyrics is just a small part of what makes this album so powerful. The main character continues to beg and bargain with Sylvia to make things go back to normal, admitting that he's terrified of how things could go. In the relationship, the main character is scared of speaking because anything could trigger an explosive, violent argument, leading to the breakdown of the main character's self-esteem, with him admitting he now hates his voice. However, on the hospice side of things, the main character is perhaps talking to Sylvia when she's asleep because it's the only time she won't be defensive. So this is the main character's only chance to tell her how he feels about her, even though he knows she can't hear him properly.
You've been living a while in the front of my skull, making orders.
These first few lines further cement what we already know. Sylvia is controlling everything in the main character's life, reflective of most abusive relationships, but despite the main character doing everything he can to follow them and please her, it's still not enough. At this point in the story, the main character has married Sylvia in a desperate attempt to fix the relationship and make it normal.
Dreams I'm a criminal, horrible, sleeping around. While you're awake, I'm impossible, constantly letting you down.
However, Sylvia does truly have a negative, untrustworthy image of the main character in her head. It seems she's acting the way she is out of malice, a genuine contempt for him. In the hospice, this could be an extension of her agony with her condition. She's angry at everything, the world, the hospice, the main character. She finds him something easy to direct her hatred at, so makes him into the most evil thing she can imagine, and then in her dreams acts out against him to relieve some of her anger. Further expanding on the word hired used in the earlier track, the main character cannot get any time off. He's always on the clock, always on call, and always needing to respond to Sylvia the moment that she wants him. In this example, she threatens him for missing a call, the lyrics describing all the things she expects him to be doing as crimes, no doubt expecting him to be cheating on her or something similar. This comes back to the theme of defensiveness. In the relationship, Sylvia is completely convinced the main character is out to get her, and that he must be going behind her back and hurting her in some way. It's an explosive outward burst of defensiveness, more akin to an attack than a defense. But in the hospice, her defensiveness is almost an inward crawl, becoming more and more reserved, cold, shut off from others, and unwilling to engage in conversation and talk to the main character. It's two ways of dealing with defensiveness, put side to side in the lyrics. In these lyrics, the main character almost feels his wedding ring has teeth. He can't take the ring off, he can't back out of the relationship now. He feels completely trapped, stuck, bound to the bedside, but still feels a sense of burden and empathy for Sylvia. He says he would take all those bullets inside you and put them inside of myself, referring to her pains and issues as bullets and just wanting to alleviate her pain. But in the same vein, he could just be wanting to simply die to get things done and over with, wanting bullets to just hit him already so he can die and leave the relationship once and for all. And in this final line, the main character knows that nobody is going to save him if he keeps pretending things are okay. But that's the only thing he can do, equating it to lying still. In the hospice, it almost evokes the idea of him making his way into the hospital bed beside her, hoping nobody spots him and takes him away so he can be as near to her as he can until she dies. Bear is one of the most emotionally impacting tracks on the record because it details one of the most tragic events on the whole album, abortion. The main character, still in his desperation to fix the relationship and makes it normal, ends up getting Sylvia pregnant, but regret sets in quickly. Referring to the baby as a bear, almost to dehumanize it and remove some of the guilt, they begin talking about abortion and how things will go back to normal, and none of their friends will know.
He's loud though without vocal cords. We'll put an end to him. We'll make all the right appointments. No one ever has to know. And then tomorrow I'll turn 21. We'll script another show. We'll play charades.
It's hard to work out if the 21 is a real age, but it seems as though he's saying they can both almost rewind to an earlier part in their lives where they must have been 21 sometime earlier in the relationship and just pretend nothing had happened, aka scripting another show.
None of our friends will come, they dodge our calls, and they have for quite a while now. It's not a shock, you don't seem to mind, and I just can't see how we're too.
Almost as a counterpart to the previous line, it doesn't matter if nobody finds out, because there is nobody to find out. It seems that through the gradual retreat from other friends and family that the main character described in earlier lines, people have just slowly stopped talking to them and are now beginning to cut contact completely. To the main character this is worrying, but to Sylvia she doesn't care.
We're not scared of making caves or finding food for him to eat. We're terrified of one another and terrified of what that means.
Looking past the bear analogy with caves and food, this line is showing that whilst the main character and Sylvia are both physically capable of raising a child, they are so incompatible and so dysfunctional as a couple that it's almost impossible for it to ever go correctly.
We'll make only quick decisions, and you'll just keep me in the waiting room. And all the while I'll know we're fucked and not getting unfucked soon. When we get home, we're big.
The end of the lyrics, before the pickup into the more upbeat section, shows the slow and gradual acceptance that the relationship is never going to be fixed. As an aside, the lyric sheet that came with the vinyl copy has much more information about the songs, which helps us piece together the story a bit more. Each song has an alternative title, and the alternative title for Bear is Children Become Their Parents, Become Their Children. This almost presents an alternative motive for the main character wanting to have an abortion. He doesn't want another Sylvia in the world. Perhaps he knows that if he aborts the child, he'll save another man from an abusive relationship like the one he's currently in, and ultimately one less abusive relationship will happen in the world. He might see himself as some kind of sacrifice, making himself miserable and taking on the emotional burden of an abortion just so that he can potentially save someone else. Following on from the lyric sheet titles, 13 has the alternative title of Sylvia Speaks. It's the first time a voice other than Peter's appears on the album, and is meant to be a fragile and breathtaking moment when we finally hear Sylvia's thoughts and voice directly, instead of inferring them through the main character's ideas and actions.
Can't you stop this all from happening? Close the doors and keep them out.
In the hospice, Sylvia wants to be pulled from her mess of tubes and medicine out of the bed and away from the whole situation. She's now drifted from a defensive and angry person to a desperate and sad one, pleading the main character to just save her from what's happening, referring to them, the other hospice workers who must perform routine tests and examinations on her, just wanting them to stay away and leave her alone for good.
Dig me out. Dig me out. Couldn't you have kept this all from happening? Dig me out from under our house.
In the relationship, before blaming the main character for what's happening again, Sylvia likens herself to being buried in the house, either under the emotional weight of everything that happens inside of it between herself and the main character, or dramatically referring to herself as already dead and buried underneath the house, almost as though the house was built on top of her and she's carried the weight of the house as though it was part of the relationship, ultimately being too much, collapsing on top of her. Two begins back in the hospice with the main character receiving the news that he dreaded. Sylvia is going to die soon. For the relationship, this means the complete breakdown of the marriage and the eventual divorce, but for now, in the hospice world, the last line here is probably the most unexpected. The main character is almost relieved to hear that Sylvia will die, potentially because the whole ordeal will finally be over. It's almost as though the main character is paraphrasing the things the doctors told him they're going to do, because he's so wrapped up in his own thoughts that he's now just translating them into his own world. The choir's going to sing could perhaps mean the team of doctors talking as they work to prepare Sylvia's final moments, and the nature of the death itself is just referred to as the thing. And this is where his world begins falling apart. The lights in the hospice begin to shatter above him, raining glass down. The line "canyon running down your femur" could potentially refer to a long self-inflicted scar on Sylvia's leg from previous self-harm, which the main character finds beautiful in some way, potentially in an effort to just blindly please and appease Sylvia. In the hospice, this canyon on her femur is most likely from the bone disease she's suffering from. The whole song is one long, continuous rant from the main character, in which he almost lets spill these feelings that have been building up inside of him, and in doing so, reveals Sylvia's backstory. It seems as though whilst talking about being in the hospital as stuck in machines, this line takes place in the relationship side, potentially showing why Sylvia is the way she is. It looks as though she had some period of anorexia as a child or a teenager, which got so bad she ended up in the hospital. Her father accelerated the whole situation, worsening her mental state and seemingly still greasing up the gears in her head, either by lasting mental damage or through maintained contact in the present day. A potential source for why Sylvia is like she is, and also explaining the previous title, "Children Become Their Parents Become Their Children." Sylvia is becoming a copy of her dad, abusive and cold. The main character is now complacent with the physical violence and the blaming. He just wants to get through this. Perhaps in his mind he knows this will all go away one day, either with a divorce or one of them dying. He knows this will happen one day, so he's just become completely glassy-eyed to the whole situation, slowly waiting for the end to come one way or another. The temporary abuse is likened to an earthquake in which he protects her throughout it, as though it's only a wave that comes and goes so that she doesn't hurt herself, which was hinted at earlier in the album. She also routinely threatens to leave, to which the main character begs and wants her to stay. It's a situation that's present in a lot of abusive relationships. It's miserable to be a part of it, but they can't let it go. However, in the lyrics we see the main character does eventually become more and more resigned to the fate of the relationship. He lets Sylvia walk away, knowing she'll come back every time.
No one understands, and so there's no open doors, there's no
But just as Sylvia can move through doors as she pleases, she also keeps them closed for others. In these lines, she closes off the relationship from outside help, from others who could spot the abuse and help the main character, or even herself. She wants to be contained within her perfect, toxic bubble. And as the main character says, there's no open doors, no way to get through. The phrase two half families suggests a fragmented, divorced family with potentially remarriages on both her mother and father's side, which further explains Sylvia's broken and abusive demeanour. Perhaps it's all she's ever known. The last line, 2 silver rings on our fingers in a hurry, shows the rushed marriage which led to the pregnancy in Bear. Shiva is the destroyer within the Hindu Trimurti, which encapsulates the idea of the track, the divorce, the end of the relationship. In the Hospice, Sylvia dies, shown by the first verse.
Suddenly every machine stopped at once and the monitors beat the last time. Hundreds of thousands of hospital beds and all of them empty but mine.
The main character then finds himself lost in a maze of hospital beds, stuck in one himself and without Sylvia. In the hospice, the situation turns from a realistic one to a nightmare, with the nurse trapped in the bed Sylvia was previously bedridden on, completely isolated. The lyrics suggest that in the relationship, now that Sylvia's gone, the main character is completely alone. Through the charades mentioned in Bear, the closing off from the outside world mentioned in Sylvia, as well as the other abuse and events in other tracks, the main character has been left without friends and without family, and now has nobody to turn to now that Sylvia is gone. All of her baggage has been left with him, however, and now her pain is his. In a way, the pain that he wanted to take onto himself as described in Atrophy has now happened, but this act of martyrdom didn't go as planned. He's now left in pain and all alone. The alternative title from the lyric sheet is Portacath Switched, referring to a chamber that sits underneath the skin used for injections during chemotherapy treatment.
Checked yourself out when you put me to bed and tore that old band off your wrist. But you came back to see me for a minute or less and left me a ring in my fist. My hair started growing, my face became yours, my femur was breaking in half. The sensation was scissors and too much to scream, so instead I just started to laugh.
The nightmare continues. The main character actually begins to replace Sylvia in the bed, becoming her and gaining her illness and her scars, complete with the bone disease which begins attacking him in the same way it did Sylvia in 2. At this point, the main character is isolated, broken, and burdened. As the haunting vocal harmony comes in at the beginning of the song, we're left with the realization that, as well as Sylvia being dead, the main character now has to face a choice. Does he continue in the world as he is, or join Sylvia himself?
The door closed, sheets drawn, the world shrinks. Let's open up those blinds. But someone has to sweep the floor, pick up her dirty clothes. That job's not mine.
It's almost as though Sylvia's departure was so sudden that her clothes are still scattered everywhere, as though her presence was so much like a hurricane that even now she's gone, her destruction has completely uprooted the house, leaving clothes and dirt everywhere. But then something happens. The main character, almost for the first time in the whole album, takes agency and shows willingness to forgive himself for what happened. Cleaning up after her, while beforehand would have almost just been commonplace, is now a chore, something he doesn't see himself doing.
Now that everyone's an enemy, my heart sinks. Let's put away those clothes. I don't blame them for their curtain call, 'cause I pulled the rope. I wanna call them back out for applause. Spring into
The main character doesn't want to fight anymore. He wants to heal and forgive and put away those claws. When referring to them, it seems he's referring to friends and family who he pushed away during the relationship to honour Sylvia's abusive patterns. In theatre, a curtain call is when the performers return back to the stage after the show to acknowledge all the applause. However, in the medical sense, we can take the line, "because I pulled the rope," as referring to the emergency pull cords used in hospitals and with the elderly. The main character pulled the emergency cord to signal he needed help. People came, hence the curtain call, but then he rejected them. He now wants them to come back to acknowledge the applause, to come and help him for real this time.
spring in Thompson on the 1st of May is horrible. We hid in catacombs.
Whilst we don't know the significance of May, Peter did outline in a Reddit AMA that he used to live on the corner of two streets, Spring Street and Thompson Street, in Lower Manhattan, New York City.
Because the hardest thing is never to repent for someone else. It's letting people.
Finally, the main character admits he needs help, and also admits how hard it's going to be, given how defensive he's become following all the events of the relationship.
But this might take all night to explain to you. I would have walked out those sliding doors, but the timing never seemed right. When your helicopter came and tried to lift me out, I put its rope around my neck.
The line between the relationship and the hospice gets blurred once again here, explaining that he would have abandoned Sylvia whilst she was still alive and just left the hospice altogether if he had the right moment, but he could never find it. The concept of putting the helicopter rope around his neck is symbolic of him using help as a weapon, taking other people's help and advice and turning it on himself to further push other people away. Once he would do something as reckless as this, other people wouldn't bother helping him anymore. And then finally, he accepts the help and begins to heal.
But I just don't know where to begin. I wanna bust down the door if you're willing to forgive. I got the keys, I'm letting people.
He also sticks up for himself, becoming stronger, accepting the pain he went through, and acknowledging how he was walked over and controlled.
Patience can't be saved. But that burden's not on you.
Calling back all the way to the lyrics of Kettering, he remembers that Sylvia was said to be unsavable, nothing could be done to fix her, and how he took it upon himself to try and do the impossible. And now that he's been left all alone, he agrees. Some people really cannot be saved, but that isn't his fault. The final repeating line serves as a reminder to the main character to never let something like this happen again. Don't ever let anyone tell you you deserve that. The epilogue is also known as Sylvia Alive in Nightmares on the lyric sheet, and unfortunately the main character cannot escape Sylvia in his nightmares. This final track bookends the album, serving as the parallel to the opening track Prologue. He finds himself sleeping in a morgue with Sylvia instead of the hospice.
Now it's not a cancer ward, we're sleeping in the morgue. Men in blue and white, they are singing all around you with heavy shovels holding earth. You're being buried to your neck.
And Sylvia, just like before, just wants to drag the main character back into the same pain and abuse as before. However, this time it's more final. Instead of dragging him into a marriage, into parenthood, or into a house, she's dragging him somewhere more final, his grave. She's almost trying to murder him, to make her mark on him so final that he'll never be able to recover. The main character, sliding back into his old ways for a second, is fighting with her, trying to reason with her, trying to save her, instead of realizing she's only just trying to kill both of them. The chorus shows the complete confusion and whirlwind of emotions and themes that ran through the relationship. They can be abusive, but then somewhat happy, apologizing for the abuse, and then going back to the start. This is a cycle also seen in real abusive relationships, where the cycle repeats endlessly.
Woken up in our bed, but there's no breathing body there beside me. Someone must have taken you while I was stuck asleep. But I know better as my eyes adjust. You've been gone for quite a while now. I don't work there in the hospital. They had to let me go.
The main character relates back to the phrase hired from Kettering. He was working in this relationship, playing a part. The phrasing on had to let me go implies it was someone else's decision and not his own, which invokes the image of a shell of a man, continuing to work but not being able to do his job properly anymore, leading to him being fired.
But you return to me at night, just when I think I may have fallen asleep. Your face is up against mine, and I'm too terrified to speak. You scream.
This plays into the idea of the main character being haunted by Sylvia and the lasting damage from their relationship still affecting him to this day, long after she's gone. And whilst that's the end of the song and the end of the album, there is one last piece of information. Whilst Prologue has no lyrics, it does have text and a story on the lyric sheet. To tie the whole project together, I'm going to read it in full. Before diving into this, I think some background would be useful. When she was younger, she had nightmares. She had scissor pain and phantom limbs and things that kept her nervous through that 12-year interim. When she fell crossing that street south of Houston, Old Manhattan land, those nightmares fell from building tops and took her by the hand. She was brought into those rooms with sliding curtains and shining children's heads. One of them, that boy, was not as lucky as she then. Years later, he would return to her at night, just when she thought she might have fallen asleep, and, as she would later describe to me, his face would be up against hers and she'd be too terrified to speak. Now, I won't pretend I understand, because I can't, and I know I never will. But something makes her sting, and something makes her want to kill. It made her crawl under that house and stick her head under that stove. Well, my point in all of this is that it's all connected in those complicated nightmares that we wove. There is an EP that preceded Hospice called New York Hospitals, which contains a sung version of these words called Sylvia, an Introduction. It seems as though when Peter decided to not have this track on the album, these lyrics gave enough of a context that he had to include them on the lyric sheet anyway. And whilst that is the end of everything that I have planned for this video, there is one last thing that I want to do. There's a bear inside your stomach, the cub's been kicking from within. His loud door without vocal cords will put an end to him. We'll make all the right appointments, no one ever has to know. And then tomorrow I'll turn 21, we'll script another show. We'll play charades up in the Chelsea, drink champagne although you shouldn't be blind and dumb until we fall asleep. None of our friends will come, they dodge our calls, and they have for quite a while now. It's not a shock you don't seem to find, but I just can't see how. We're too old, we're not old at all, just too old. We're not old at all. There's a bear inside your stomach, the cub's been kicking you for weeks. Well, if this isn't all a dream, we'll cut him from beneath. We're not scared of making caves, finding food for him to eat. We're terrified of one another and terrified of what that means. We'll make only quick decisions and you'll just keep me in the waiting room. And all the while I know we're fucked and not getting unfucked soon. When we get home we're bigger strangers than we've ever been before. You sit in front of snowy television, your suitcase on the floor. We're too old, we're not old at all, just too